This ZeroNow program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I'm just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
I am just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
All right, folks, I'm Ara Bagdasarian, the founder of OmniAlert and board president of ZeroNow, and welcome to this ZeroNow sessions, Preventing Cyber Threats on Campus. So background, ZeroNow is a stakeholder alliance formed to drive ideas, innovation, and investment for safe campuses. As a membership-based nonprofit, ZeroNow facilitates collaboration between industry, association, and education partners to foster new solutions to keep our campuses safe and secure. Before we get started, we want to recognize our sponsors and founding partners who made this program possible. Thank you to Access Communications, Additional Corporation, Telos Corporation, OmniAlert, IACLEA, VTV Family Outreach Foundation, NASPA, the Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education, and Campus Safety Magazine. If you're interested in learning more about ZeroNow or becoming a member, please visit zeronow.org. Now let's introduce our panelists, distinguished panelists today. First, we have Vince Scheivert. Vince has served in the public sector for more than 20 years, mostly as a chief information technology officer. Most recently, Vince served as the assistant superintendent of digital innovation at Loudoun County Public Schools, which is one of Virginia's largest school systems. Today, Vince brings that same innovation mindset to Telos, where he serves as the president of technical sales for state, local, and education markets. Telos is a leading provider of cyber, cloud, and enterprise security solutions in the world's most security conscious organizations. Welcome, Vince.
Thanks, Ara. Appreciate you having me.
Curtis McNay, welcome, Curtis. Curtis has been the director of IT security at George Mason University since 2008. His responsibilities include ensuring the daily protection of Mason's enterprise by developing secure business processes, monitoring cyber threats, and responding to cybersecurity incidents. He and his team have implemented and managed Mason's cybersecurity systems. Curtis and his team have presented at a number of industry conferences, including VASCAN, EDUCAUSE Security, ACCS, and Splunk.com. Welcome, Curtis.
Thanks for having me.
And we have Antoinette King. Antoinette has 21 years of experience in the security industry, holding roles including engineered system specialist, operations manager, regional sales manager, and key account manager. Antoinette founded Credo Cyber Consulting in 2020 with the goal of providing her clients with a holistic perspective on security, bridging the gap between the physical and cybersecurity domains, focused on data privacy and protection. And Antoinette will be speaking at CSC West next month in Las Vegas. Is that right?
Yes, ISC West.
ISC West. Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, Antoinette, and panelists. Now, we have a group of professionals on from both higher education and K through 12. So, Curtis, being in higher education, what is the different types of cyber threats between higher education and K through 12? How do they differ?
Higher ed, at least larger institutions, are more like cities, and protection is really protecting all of the facets that go into a city. You have physical infrastructure, you have healthcare services, you have police. You have all kinds of different areas to protect. So in that regard, I think has a lot more complexity typically than K through 12. K through 12 is probably more of a standard vertical.
And Vince, I mean, your background in K through 12, how do you see cyber threats differing in that space?
Yeah, so it's an interesting perspective. I'll share that Loudoun had over 120 campuses. 86,000 kids. We operated as a small city and larger than most universities. What I would say is both organizations have critical infrastructure. They both have critical data and assets available to them. And they both suffer from insider threats as well as external threats. And how we would go about managing that, I think one of the key differentials is in the K-12 space. For the most part, we're providing our users with the credentials and the devices to be the insider threat, to where at the university level, they typically have the opportunity to bring their own in. But But from my lens and my view now, the amount of external pressure on both educational institutions in terms of digital harm that bad actors want to perpetrate is pretty equal.
Well, so Curtis, how in God's name do you manage bring your own device environment on a higher education campus? How can you assess the inventory when you have people bringing their own devices?
So a couple of topics there. Inventory, we start with that. Inventorying systems, software, understanding privileged access, controlling privileged access, looking at the stack around that privileged access, including the device that they're coming in, and focusing on that first. Obviously, for adjunct faculty that may be on campus 2 nights a week and have limited access to central data and central systems, BYOD is probably appropriate for them, and containing them on the network layer to a space where they really don't have access to sensitive systems is a method to manage that BYOD and protect sensitive resources.
And Aaron,
go ahead, Vince.
Yeah, so Aaron, to jump in on that, I think one of the places that the universities kind of really have a leg up on the K-12s, that K-12s suffered during the pandemic, was the loss of the perimeter. So we talked about what's the same, what's different. Universities have always been dealing with the idea that they've lost containment of their perimeter, and how do they secure from inside out versus outside in, to where, for the most part, for years, I had the ability to build this really robust, tight network capability that protected them because all of the work was being done on campus. And today, that just isn't the case. In Loudon, we rolled out 86,000 Chromebooks. Kids went everywhere from whether in this country or in other countries, to where we're getting service calls from Turkey and other places. That was a new paradigm for a lot of K-12s, is the idea that you now need to be able to secure out to the edge versus just at the building or site level.
So Vince, that expanded dramatically for higher ed too in this crisis too. I would say that, a reliance upon cloud services and, seeing folks popping up in Russia and elsewhere attaching to the network. Yeah. And it's being normal. Yeah. And
that's the cool part, that it's normal now. Like, it used to send out red flags and people are running down the hallway. Now it's like, oh yeah, okay.
When I was going for my master's degree, this was a couple of years back, but we had professors that were living in the country of Georgia, right? So that university was able to provide us with access. But Vince, that was actually what I was going to kind of interject in about the whole what's the difference. For the most part, traditionally, K through 12 environments had far more control, if you will, as much as you can have, over the assets, over the flow of data, over the credentialing. Whereas in the higher education environment, most higher education spaces are based on open campus, the openness of information, the openness of learning and education. So it's really, I could imagine for Curtis, challenging to balance that openness with also securing things, especially when it comes to research and that kind of thing.
Right. So the traditional openness used to be primarily on campus openness.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing now, of course, is cloud openness and identity checking and access control, wherever you're coming from to wherever you're going, which is expanding for everybody. So
I just want to remind, and I didn't even mention this earlier, but to participants, if you have a question for our panelists, please hit the Q&A button. We have a chat. There's a chat dialogue as well, but please submit your questions via Q&A. We'll answer those about halfway through the program. Now, when it comes to the individual students, okay, I understand there's the whole physical infrastructure side of things, but when it comes to the students, Antoinette, how do you best educate students about cyber threats on an individual basis? How do you convey that?
So personally, I'll give you my pie in the sky, what I wish would happen versus what actually is currently the state of affairs, in my opinion. So what I wish would happen is that starting at the K through 12 environment at an age appropriate level, that cyber hygiene just becomes part of curriculum. It can be part of math. It could be part of social studies. It can be part of ELA, English Learning Arts, right? There's English language arts, rather. There are so many opportunities in current curricula to sprinkle cyber hygiene in and teach students about, keeping themselves safe, what the national threat landscape does look like, how the individual citizens are becoming the attack vector versus nation state versus, where it used to be nation state versus nation state. Now the individual citizens are becoming the attack vector. I think it's really important. I say this all the time. We give young people tools, adult tools with access to adult information, and we give them no education on how to protect themselves from predators, how to protect themselves from misinformation and disinformation, right? Let them know what that means and how that it could potentially influence the decisions and the choices that they make. So what I would love to happen is that we integrate that into the K-12 environment and then carry it through as part of culture in higher education, where we empower young people to take a little bit of control back of their own individual personal information and privacy. Unfortunately, because of social media being rolled out far faster than we had the capacity to teach young people about cyber hygiene and personal information and protecting themselves and privacy in general, the notion of privacy has gone completely out the window. So now it's like, how do you put that genie back in the bottle? And I think that that's a really serious challenge, but there are plenty of ways that we can speak to young people in age appropriate ways about the dangers of the internet and, what the different attacks and threats look like without scaring the heck out of them, so that they can sleep at night.
So, I kind of think back, and now I want to date myself a little bit. So back when I would watch cartoons and stuff, there would be McGruff the crime dog. And McGruff the crime dog told me all the things I needed to do to stay safe in that physical world. Look both ways, don't take candy from strangers. Like, it was ingrained in you throughout the whole process. That's missing.
Yeah.
That's missing. So what is the digital look both ways, whether it's checking an email, checking links? To Antoinette's point, it's a void right now.
One of the things that I really advocate for is creating digital learning days in an educational environment, teaching young people about all of the different things, from cyberbullying to how to do proper research and look for credible, what an opinion piece versus what a scholarly resource is. And then also about, digital addiction and what that looks like in young people. We used to have the food plate. This is how I talk about it when I talk to younger kids. I did 4th and 5th grade session once. And you used to have all the food groups and what the proper portion of each food group is. A little bit of everything is good, but a lot of any one good thing is never good. And we talked about that, about the time that you spend on digital devices, because it's not just cell phones and iPads and computers. It's also dealing with, gaming devices and Discord. I mean, I don't know, but I just recently found out about Discord. Apparently it's been a thing for a while. I was asked to present to a college cybersecurity group on Discord. And I'm like, what the hell is Discord? I'm sorry, what the heck is Discord? I'm a cyber professional. I didn't even know it existed. I get on this platform and it's the Wild West. And now I'm thinking how many kids are using that and parents don't even know about it.
It's still possible to provide common guidance for all of these platforms, right? How to think about it, how to critically think about this.
Yes.
Sure.
Is there common guidance still, Curtis?
Say again?
Is there common guidance that exists?
Yeah, I think there is common guidance. It's critical thinking around these. It's kind of like the traditional. I'm going to date myself. It's kind of like the traditional advice around phishing email, which is still a huge risk, right? It's the becoming sophisticated at what you're looking at and identifying the tells that make it bad, make it suspicious, right? If someone is engaging you, so social engineering attacks have matured. It's not just the direct attack asking you for a way to get money, but it may start as an engagement to try to get you to socialize, okay? And then to build trust, and then to perform an attack, right? So knowing what that looks like.
I love the concept of cyber hygiene, or teaching that as part of the curriculum at a very young age. Go ahead, Vince.
Yeah, no. So I think Curtis touched on a piece around the whole ransomware issue. And if you're not aware, ransomware has drastically shifted in the last year, to where the primary goal of ransomware was to quickly encrypt your environment to solicit a response and a payment. Today, that isn't the case. So the anatomy of ransomware is to follow the path, as Curtis was saying, to be able to capture and get as much information and data about the organization, about the users, about secondary users and secondary targets. And what we're seeing now is bad actors are in an environment anywhere 6 to 9 months before they cause a disruption and start to solicit that response. Which you think about the amount of information and data that a bad actor could get before triggering that bad day for somebody. It's really an issue, and it all starts with our people.
No, let me ask you. So, I mean, you talk about threats and vulnerabilities. How safe is it to host your security applications in the cloud? Does that low level of vulnerability exceed the value of having applications in the cloud?
For me, it depends on the vendor. It depends on the provider, right? So the trick is for assurance that the vendor is dotting their I's and crossing their T's. So third-party assessment becomes critical for an organization who is relying more and more on cloud services. You've got to have a robust third-party risk assessment process that is lifecycle.
100%. I couldn't agree more. I think that if anything that we've learned in the last 12 to 18 months on all of the different supply chain attacks is that it is incumbent on any organization, whether it's a higher education, a K through 12, or an enterprise or government agency, it's incumbent to do your due diligence when you're partnering with a vendor. And if you have standards within your organization for the way that data is being handled, so for example, you're dealing with COPA or FERPA, you've got standards and governance and regulation around that data. Those same standards should apply to the data no matter where it's housed. So if you're using a cloud service to house student information or HR information, or like Curtis mentioned, they've got healthcare organizations within, these subgroups within the campus. It's super important to hold your vendors to those same standards.
To pick up on Antoinette saying is, there's a big differential between hosting providers and SaaS providers. And to Curtis's and Antoinette's point of making sure you're doing your due diligence, that you have your data breach contracts in place and your data governance contracts in place. But I will say, as companies and groups and schools are making the transition to the cloud, to where they're taking their infrastructure and moving it into like an AWS, an Azure, a Google, et cetera, it's hard to argue that you're not more safe in the cloud than you are on-prem.
Can be with PaaS, with platform as a service.
And as can be. Yep. So what you start to look at there in the conversation that shifts is you end up in a shared security model, and you have the ability to then leverage capabilities and skill sets that cloud provider gives you the ability to do that otherwise, more than likely, especially at the K-12 level, you're not going to have the opportunity or capability of having that type of level of resource or engineering support in order to do it. And I know the university is in a slightly different position in terms of funding and human capital, but I can tell you on the K-12 side, to be able to have a cloud engineer, good luck. In terms of affording, there's like 10 teachers you could buy for one cloud engineer. So making that purchase is tough.
And it has to be a trusted partnership. That's where it becomes, instead of a vendor, customer relationship, it truly is partnership when it comes to securing that information.
So what questions should you be asking your vendors when it comes to hosting the application in the cloud?
I think Antoinette mentioned it. Your organization should have a strong security policy, standard, process, and procedure, and you should hold your vendors to that same standard. There are specific controls and areas that are specific to PaaS to cloud or to SaaS vendors. Be aware of those. But you're asking the same questions of your vendors. Are your vendors, for their management, are they using two-factor? Are they encrypting data? Are they handling their encryption keys properly? Do they practice good code review? Are they doing static and dynamic code testing in their development process? The same things that you should be doing, they should be doing.
And to that point, I mean, you really want to make sure that you have a governance process in place for you. I mean, it's hard to ask that of a vendor if you haven't internalized that, hey, I'm going to follow an industry best practice, whether it's a CSF, a CIS, some kind of security framework yourself to turn around and be able to know what questions to ask a vendor. So the first part I would say is you better make sure your own house is in order and make sure you're tight.
It's a good point. I would actually suggest if you don't know what control looks like, how are you going to measure it with your vendors?
Roger that.
Good point. Antoinette, you had a thought on this.
Yeah, I was going to say something. Coming from physical security for so many years and being in the manufacturing side of physical security, one of the arguments I often had with manufacturers is they would build a product, whether it be software or hardware, with this robust list of security features and hardware security features like TPM modules and signed firmware and all these really great things. And they had the ability to support HTTPS, all of the cybersecurity buzzwords that create an environment of, hardened devices. But when you buy them, they're default level 0 security. You have to turn on all of the features or turn off FTP and all these other things. And it's like, or NTP. And it's like, wait a second, why are we putting the onus on the person doing the implementation? Like, why wouldn't we make it hardened out of the box and then let them turn it off and have the liability on them? So in terms of questions, you need to ask, like, what is your default security postures? What do I need to do to ensure that where my data is protected? Do I need to turn things on and off? Oftentimes, you'll see the list of features and security functions on their website, but that's not default. You may have to pay extra for certain things. So be really clear and understand what their language is. Everybody's got to speak a common language. Sometimes what you say is one thing is something totally different to someone else. So I think just having open dialogue and open communication is really important.
Never assume. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Vince, I know one of the things that Telos does is, quote unquote, securing your security systems. So how, to Antoinette's point, when it comes to physical security, how can you secure your physical security from cyber threats, from disabling surveillance camera systems or the network or other assets?
So I can't remember the manufacturer now, but we just saw within the last year or so the whole video cam leak to where we saw hospitals, universities, prisons, and those kinds of systems were always peripheral. Like they were always on the outlying of the technology landscape, almost the way HVAC were until they got hacked and caused major disruptions in a bunch of different places. And I think what we're seeing, is I think we're seeing the convergence of what the physical threats and virtual threats, kind of how they intermingle, because that information and that data is being used, again, for ways to be able to find weaknesses, capabilities, and issues to really cause harm.
Yeah, so to Vince's point, all of you out there, you have cameras in your system. Generally, the default configuration is that every one of those is a web server, and every one of them has a default admin password that your attacker only needs to pull up the manual for it to understand. And if you haven't locked those down, if you haven't put those in a protected network, they are owned by someone else.
And they all have local storage. So if they can't communicate back to the head-end unit, they all have multiple days of information in video that could be downloaded directly. So it's really interesting to see the way that landscape's shifting and changing, and ways that people are looking to be able to address that, to remove that as an attack surface.
I have to tell you, when I started in the security industry, I was a technician. So I was building out the infrastructure. And I remember that our answer, because that was like the first phase convergence. Now you're talking about convergence now. This I call it the second wave, second convergence. But the first thing was just taking analog devices and putting them on networks. And I remember that our answer to information security, Curtis, you're going to cringe, was microsegmentation. We were just going to build our own network and forget about IT, because they were the roadblocks. They were the ones that gave us a hard time. So we were going to create, our own. We were going to pull our own cable, put in our own switches. We were going to use our own IP scheme, the whole 9 yards. And so, unfortunately, in this IoT environment now, we've created an entire generation, probably two, of technicians that believe wholeheartedly that because they are on their own physical network, they're impervious to cyber attacks, and that they don't have any necessary liability on the total security posture for the entire organization. And the same serves for, and in even more immature environments are the HVAC and the lighting environments. They're even less mature than physical security. But I was one of those people, we just thought that if we got off of the data network, with the operational network, that we were good and we didn't cause an issue. And I, to this day, have arguments with very prominent vendors that are like, no, if by the time they get to us, that the end customer has a bigger problem. And in my eyes, it's like, but why do you want to be that guy, right? And so when you're choosing your vendors that are doing these implementations, you've got to worry. We're talking about asset inventory. It's asset inventory for hardware, software, and that shadow IT that you don't even know about. How do you inventory something if you don't even know it exists?
They're the little hidden gems to where they have a modem locked in some janitor's back closet that's communicating with the internet continuously, but are completely siloed off, or so they think. But they're all network aware. They all kind of have these. I mean, one of the things that always made me shiver was when somebody said, "Hey, what about building automation?" Like. And where are you going to put that? Like, who's putting that in? So, and to your point, a lot of times they'll go around IT because IT will ask those hard questions, and they see that as a.
So you put up the right gates. It's important to have the right gates. If you're responsible for controlling your organization, you need to put up the gates that prevent that type of thing. So no one instantiates on the network without going through a process.
Yeah, I think I like to say, because InfoSec and the IT people have always got a bad rap as being kind of the gatekeepers. So I often talk about physical security and cybersecurity as the guide rails by which we do business. And so rather than saying that InfoSec is going to be a roadblock for you, it's as long as InfoSec and cyber people are involved from day one, they're going to provide you the path to do what you want to do. Just do it safely. And that should be the culture of every environment, right? Knowing how to involve the right people to make sure that the systems are set up properly from the beginning.
I think it's an excellent point. I think it's also developing the thought processes of DevOps and DevSecOps in your organization. Even if it's not around code development, it's really about automating processes. So security is built in and is largely invisible when a request is made.
Great point.
Now, how does we're talking about different aspects of physical structures and everything? Where does IoT play? How does it impact your security policy, since everything now has an IP address attached to it? How does IoT impact it?
Which IoT? So we've had printers that have been hacked. We have drones on campus. We have all kinds of sensors There are a lot of we're a Research One university, so there's a lot of IoT in the research space. That's there's a big challenge around this. It's really again, if something is going to something is coming up that is not an endpoint, okay, and you don't understand that user endpoint device, it's another class of system. You have to take a look at it, and you have to decide on the risk associated. We've actually had exercise equipment compromised.
Wow. Okay.
So you really have to think about it, right? In some instances where there's low risk and there's a need for it to talk to the cloud, you segment it off. You put it behind a firewall so you can see the traffic on it, okay? And you segment it off from your privileged space so that it can't insert itself into privileged activity.
Or you build a separate network like Antoinette would do.
Well, that's what it is. It's the segmentation, separate network. But that
You have to have
you have to be practical.
You have to have a risk mitigation policy. And Curtis brought it up at the beginning, and he's spot on. It's about inventory, but inventory isn't the physical pieces. It's your crown jewels. What are the things that you need to protect most? And for the most part, there are going to be digital repositories of data that that have a high value to somebody. And it's not always the same crown jewels. So how do you have and a plan to mitigate the ability for bad actors, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to do things to those crown jewels?
Right. So that's hygiene. Inventory, assess, classify, have a program around risk management for those critical resources.
100%.
I think it's interesting, you mentioned that your organization, Curtis, is a research venue, right? So years ago, there was a major event. It was probably one of the biggest, but it was back when there was still dial-up modems for a university out in California, that they were a research lab for the DoD. And there were bad actors that were coming in through dial-up, believe it or not, modems, and using the university to then gain access to DoD facilities all over the country. And so that's something super challenging for research environments, where you become the hub for all of these other organizations. It's a lot more risk involved, right? Yeah. And it's kind of like a quasi supply chain attack, because you are the hub that's going to connect all of these other organizations, and probably the other organizations have even more valuable data, information, whatever. So that liability is concerning too.
Yeah, I don't want to veer too far off, but you're right around research. The FBI will tell you that actors are interested in research before it gets classified, and that's what happens in the university space, right? Before it gets protected, before it gets classified, it is open research.
And again, that part of the culture of that open research is the openness. So now you have to start instilling into individuals who inherently want to share, right, for the right reasons, but don't realize the ramifications of what could happen if that information falls in the bad hands, right? So trying to change that culture is really challenging.
So
research is a tough one. Yeah.
There's a couple big things that are kind of happening that I think we're seeing come out of the federal space. One, in the DoD now requiring the CMMC as they kind of fix that and come up with a better
Don't get me started.
A better version of that. But it's also what we're seeing with the Federal Student Aid Agency with their requirement that if they're going to provide universities money, that at least universities have to come up and be able to demonstrate compliance with the 800-171, which is, in my opinion, it's a great thing because it now brings everybody up to a standard. Now, whether or not that standard is at the level that we need across the nation, it gives us a starting point. And to all your point, the figure that I've heard thrown around is something around $6 billion of intellectual property is stolen from universities every year in terms of its worth. So it's not like $50. it's large amounts of information and data that's being stolen and transferred out. So it's a big deal.
Universities are
you're muted.
for their pipes, for their openness, for their compute resources, and for the research.
And Curtis, what about the university's legacy systems? How do you deal with that when it regards to cyber? Do you still have legacy systems at George Mason University?
We largely do not have legacy systems.
I feel like that's a K through 12 issue. I think that a lot of K through 12 environments that I've been, so in New York State, they had some funding available for, it was called the Smart School Bond Act. And essentially the state was providing financial resources to K through 12 in order to improve their infrastructure. But of course, there was a lot of red tape around that, and you had to basically expend the money in advance, and then you'd get reimbursed for it. And it was this whole to do. So a lot of the schools couldn't necessarily take as much advantage, but I think a lot of K through 12 environments are still trying to upgrade. And I think COVID caught a lot of schools by surprise because they didn't have the infrastructure to be able to provide access, and ended up using public systems to do Zoom calls and all those other things, and caught a lot of them, by surprise. And ransomware went rampant in the K through 12 environment.
And we could have a completely different conversation with that same question when we talk local and state governments.
Yeah.
In terms of legacy systems.
The same problem. That's right.
Yeah.
Or
to say
potentially a greater
this
problem.
big in EDU, it's that big in state and local. So, for sure.
I think the key to legacy systems is if it's absolutely necessary, then you just harden the heck out of it. You know what I'm saying? You just put enough layers, just like in physical security, we do the concentric circles, layers of protection, defense in depth. You just put as much around it as possible to harden it until you can get to a point where you can get rid of the system and replace it.
Before we jump into some of the participant questions, we have a few questions that came in from registrations, but I just want to touch upon this because I think this is very important. Antoinette, what role does social media have to play when it comes to cybersecurity?
Oh man, it's so from a large scale misinformation, disinformation campaign, it could be extremely influential in terms of, especially in the higher education, to start sparking controversy, right? And to start sparking events, so that you've got this social media influence sparking violence or other things on a campus. So that misinformation and disinformation from a nation state perspective is a serious tool that's used against the United States in particular in order to create a hostile environment within different groups, right? So being able to be influenced through social media. The flip side of that, especially in the K through 12 environment, that makes me nervous is that children are being targeted by predators because of, they're in isolated situations during COVID, especially. Predators are catfishing young people, which if you don't know what catfishing is, it's someone pretending to be somebody else, pretending to be another young person. And unfortunately, children, both in K through 12 and in higher education, are being abducted and sold into human trafficking environments. So parents need to be aware that there's this massive influx of human trafficking victims over the last 2 years during COVID. Parents are, either working remotely or kids are at home, and parents are working because they're, first responders or whatever it is. And so it just fosters this really terrible environment where kids are looking to social media to find their self-worth, and then they've got cyberbullying is also an issue. So in my opinion, social media has a really negative impact on safety of children in general, and then often can cause this friction between groups and potentially have people, strike violence in schools as well.
Next month, we're going to be discussing emergency communications, but how does a campus or school address disinformation?
Curtis?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, obviously, campuses typically are open idea environments, right? I don't think we have the same kind of concern that Antoinette was expressing for K through 12. I think that's a very real concern. Okay. And honestly, the social and emotional risk to the student population isn't really in my space. But I'm a parent, so I feel it, and
Right.
I agree, right? So I'm more concerned around those tools being used to perpetrate fraud against students and faculty. It happens with some regularity. So those are the things that I focus on in my space. Identity theft, those are real concerns too.
Mm-hmm.
Ara, I think one of the big things is just the convergence of your digital life and your physical life. It seems weird to us that those two things somebody would talk about them as a single stream, but in reality for kids today, your digital life is every much as part of your physical life. So behavioral manifestations that occur that end up being represented often start in the digital space and move to the physical space. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of bad things happen here, especially recently, but the effects of the digital have obviously impacts on their physical beings. And I think that's part of maybe what's so difficult as an adult for us to rationalize that, because it's new to us. But like, my son is now 15 and he's never lived in a world to where an iPhone hasn't been commercially available at a 3G level. So for 15 years, he's been a fully immersed young person who it's part of his overall persona. For all of us on this call, it's something new. Like we'll probably reminisce over the Nokia Unbreakables.
When Snapchat came out with Snap Map.
We got a phone call here. Hang on. Hold on. Let me take this real quick.
I love that flip phone. Oh my gosh.
Oh, I still use it. I don't trust the no.
Pull up my Samsung i300.
Oh man. When Snapchat came out with that feature Snap Map, which if you don't know is essentially every time your child sends a picture over it, it gives metadata to show exactly where they're located. I lost my mind because it was defaulted on. And so you had to turn it off. And so when I found out about it, I immediately, my kids are older, so it was easier for me to contain, but a lot of the young people don't see a problem because they are innocent and they believe good and all that when they send their picture across Snapchat openly to everybody, that it's okay to have their location on the Snap. So that whole cyber hygiene education K-12 thing, that's why, because they've been desensitized, as been said, they've been desensitized to how wrong these things truly are.
And I think the bigger piece is what they also don't realize is that information is all available to anybody that wants it. So that open API that a lot of these social media platforms have that allow you to extract that information and that data, both good actors and bad actors are using that as for monetary purposes, which I think a lot of times goes.
A lot of gray area in that too, right? A lot of commercialization of that data.
100%.
Those are things that can be controlled, but I feel for the average person in trying to control it.
Is that I've just been reading up on this in preparation. Is that considered open source intelligence, Vince? Being able to access that information. Okay, good stuff. All right, listen, we have about 15 minutes left, and we have a lot of questions that are coming in online. But let's first take some of the questions that came in via the registration, since they asked in advance. So Rachel Mosley asked from Scarsdale Public Schools, strict password policies and two-factor authentication are paramount for network security. Neither is realistic for young children. Do you have recommendations? So how do you deal with two-factor authentication
So biometrics.
I was going to go passwordless. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, to get to passwordless biometrics and device control. So if you can, that is zero trust. The zero trust model really is something like biometrics and manage devices that are trusted. And those combinations are stronger than password. NIST is deprecating password change, has deprecated password change process, right?
And I think there are tools out there to help with that. So there are single sign-on solutions that'll do multiples to where young kids can use and leverage symbols rather than actual characters or alphabets, to where they have the ability to potentially use QR codes or other physical media that would then be read. So I think there are some things out there in the environment, in the ecosystem, to be able to really hone in on those little guys who we know aren't going to put in a 17-character passphrase with multiple different layers.
And I also think I want to put it out there. I was just going to say that the biometrics in New York in particular is against the law, but we underestimate young people and what they're capable of. And so when I think multi-factor authentication, if we're going like token, for example, you'd be surprised what kids can and can't do. If the tokens are in the classroom and they have, let's say, a 4-digit, because they have to remember their student ID for when they do their lunch program. I was concerned when my kids were in kindergarten that they had to remember the 6-digit student ID. They remembered it. It was no problem for them. So if we're going to do, perhaps a passcode and a token, if the tokens are part of the, attached to the computer with a little dongle or whatever, we underestimate young people and what they're capable of doing.
Digital natives. Go ahead, Curtis.
So the perfect is the enemy of the good too, right? You want to get to something that is reasonable and that is better, and not make it so hard that it's people find a way around it, for sure.
Yep, no doubt. Jeff Powers asks, and this is a question that came in the Q&A as well, where should education institutions start? Is there a comprehensive list of action items?
So standard framework, CIS, which is now 18. It used to be SANS 20. It's now CIS 18. Center for Internet Security, 18 control families. Okay. Or adopt another control family like NIST 853 or the NIST cybersecurity framework. Okay. Start with the basic controls and then watch your maturity. Pay attention to maturity and pay attention to risk. So, for instance, in both the cybersecurity framework and in CIS 18 controls, the first control is inventory. Inventory classify, right? Get an understanding of where your risk is. And then watch your maturity across those controls. Pay attention and advance your maturity.
And to piggyback on that, and I saw it in the questions too, Ara, is when you go for cyber insurance, they're going to want to know what your overall risk posture is. And if you can't demonstrate it or talk about it, there's a strong likelihood that you'll be dropped. And if they're not going to drop you, they're going to come in and provide and do an audit and doing a full-blown risk assessment on you, at which point you're going to see your premiums go up about 3 to 4x. And then, since they've already identified those as existing vulnerabilities inside your environment, if the event occurs inside of those areas and they weren't mitigated, then they don't have to pay out. The cyber insurance industry is under huge amounts of pressure, and we're tracking all kinds of things there. But adopting a framework, an industry best practice framework, 100% gives you solid footing to be able to articulate your overall risk posture and how well you're able to demonstrate.
And each state is different. And I think it's important in the K-12 environment, especially if your state regulates data privacy, for example, you need to make sure that this is where I would say that privacy meets security, because you need to make sure that you're adhering and complying with the regulations in your state for privacy, especially for student information. There are some federal ones like COPA, PPRA, those things. Make sure that you're meeting those minimum requirements for data privacy, and then layering over the 18 principles from CIS, Now you're creating a program, right? And that, to Curtis's point, that maturity piece, I always say, like, if you're starting from scratch, year 1 is compliance, year 2 is security, year 3 is maturity. That's when you're really going to be able to demonstrate that you have a mature program.
It all depends on resources. I would love to see organizations get to maturity in year 3. That would be fantastic. That would be fantastic. Start somewhere and keep building your program. Privacy is not security, okay? Right. But security can help provide for control around privacy.
Yep.
So think of them separately, but they have some overlap and they are intertwined.
Good point.
Are you muted?
Always that guy. That's twice in one meeting. Let's take a couple questions from the folks. And by the way, Antoinette posted a link in the chat. We're also going to send out a key takeaways document next week after the session. Some of the key points that were made today and some of the references that the panelists have shared with you. So just keep an eye out for that in your email. So Laura Fleming asks, and we kind of touched upon this earlier, but what are some of the unique challenges that schools, higher ed and K-12 alike have compared to other institutions or industries? I mean, Antoinette, maybe because I think you probably work across multiple industries. I mean, are there specific unique challenges that you see in education versus manufacturing or any other industry?
Resources. Curtis hit the nail on the head. The lack of resources. You know, in commercial industry, you can make more money so that you can spend more money. In K-12, first of all, the budgets are made a year or 2 in advance, and even in higher education as well. And security is traditionally a cost center in any environment, but in the K-12 and higher education environment, it's the roadblock to everything, right? Every system that they want to implement could potentially be more expensive because you have to apply controls around it. So it's more expensive potentially to implement, and it's more expensive to manage, potentially. That doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. It's the right thing to do. But unfortunately, it's bad enough in commercial environment, but at least we can demonstrate an ROI in commercial environment that you can't necessarily connect the dots directly in a K-12 or higher education.
Yeah, the concept of risk management and the maturity of risk management in industry is generally much more understood and followed. Higher education history is a bit of a challenge to get over. Higher ed typically is very decentralized. It still is. Talking to my higher ed brothers out there, many universities still have decentralized IT. Even at Mason, there is much IT outside of the central IT as there is inside of central IT. Okay, there are more than one research cluster that sits outside of central IT control. Okay, so the culture, there's a culture change to it. Getting to a point where you have reasonable control around the endpoints, and you don't have departments going out and buying their PCs at Best Buy. Okay, those types of things are still battles that are fought in higher ed.
I also think kind of looking at it and seeing what the overall landscape, it's the adherence to a standard. So for a lot of these commercial institutions, or even at the federal level, they have to be compliant with. It's not a consideration of not. It's a consideration of you have to. And when you have to do something versus could do something, your outcomes are generally drastically different. And it's always kind of been seen as a nice to have in the EDU space, not a need to have. And until some of that changes, whether that's from the federal level or the state level, I think we're always going to grapple with that issue in the EDU space.
And Vincent, as you stated earlier, in the EDU space, it is beginning to happen with CMMC requirements and CUR requirements, and the Department of Education writing letters to university around expectations around security control.
Yep. Well, good stuff. Good time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Susan Washburn asks, how do we protect our university from an internal personnel threat that can compromise our security systems? Is that a common question, Curtis?
It's not the traditional Edward Snowden problem where you have a bad actor. It's someone not understanding what good control is and exposing data unintentionally. That's very common. Okay.
I always say that the weakest link in most security programs is between the seat and the keyboard.
That's right. That's right. So humans are soft, right?
So how do you address that?
Soft.
And we're busy, right, Curtis? I mean, we're busy. So I can imagine, especially right now, in this crazy world we live in, where campuses are hybrid and they've got all things going on, and people are not used to the tools that they're using now. And then they get this email that says, "Oh, you need to register for this, whatever." They're going to click on it because they just want to do the right thing. They want to register. They want to do their job.
You got to try to we have to get better at making cybersecurity easier and seamless and invisible to users. The industry has to move in that direction, because you're absolutely right. You can't expect the average person to always follow, and you have habit too. We have it, and it's not always about intelligence or sophistication. Just someone with a habit of always clicking. Honestly, I can't tell you. I can't mention names, but I can't tell you the long list of people who have responded to phish at Mason. So, and phish can be very sophisticated too. I'm not saying that it can't be, but it is the person that usually provides the risk, and that's what you see in the news too. Someone responding to a phish.
And so it's really the answer to the question is education. I think making cyber education part of not a yearly watch a 30-minute video and answer 3 questions to check the box of compliance, but actually part of, if you're doing these phishing campaigns on a regular basis, so that people they know they're going to get a report card at the end of the month or the end of the quarter. How many phishing emails did they click on, right? You have to have it. Yeah. You have to start deprogramming people. And my dad's one of those clicky McClickerson. He just click. It's a dad stuff.
Time to upgrade. Wow. I just upgraded Word last week.
So, it's funny. And along with those programs, you have to make them reward-based, not punitive-based. And I think that's been, so if I'm going to air dirty laundry, I was more on the punitive side, to where you're now going to do things. And we focused on what the negative outcome of it was going to be versus the positive one. Like give a prize away. I mean, it could just be like a silly stuffed animal that's going to be the spam killer of the week kind of thing, and it's going to rotate around. But just something to make it more positive to find the problem versus the negative part of when people do things.
That gamification.
Yeah, at least do both.
Right. All right, we have time for one quick question. This I think kind of ties into what we already discussed, but Michael Campisi asks, do you think it's possible to have students participate in cyber privacy program development for schools?
Yeah.
Is it possible? Are schools doing that?
My niece is in Florida. She's part of the, they have a Cyber Champions program. She's in 11th grade. She participates in monthly, it's through a junior ROTC program, but they participate in monthly competitions. The stuff she's doing is unbelievable. It's mind blowing to me that what she's learning, and she loves it. And it's natural to her because she doesn't know any better. They teach them all sorts of things for forensics investigations, all sorts of tools, open source intelligence, like we were mentioning before. Absolutely. Kids should be empowered to be a part of the solution.
There's a huge gap and a huge need for cybersecurity professionals. Mason has at least 2 programs for high school and college students to learn and do cyber competition. Sure.
And before we jump off, there is one more question in there about CISA and some requirements and issues. I will say that CISA has theoretically completed their study, or was supposed to have completed their study on the K-12. as part of the K-12 Cybersecurity Act of 2021. So they are supposed to, again, always that's supposed to with the feds, publish their findings or potentially first draft recommendations within the next, I think it's like 30 to 60 days. So there should be some information coming out as far as the K-12 space as it relates to CISA and the work that they're doing.
Awesome. Thanks, Vince. All right. Yeah, we have run out of time, and just wanted to thank Antoinette, Curtis, Vince for joining us today. Awesome discussion. To participants, you will receive like I mentioned, the key takeaways later this week or early next week, usually about a week from the time we wrap things up. Our next sessions webinar is March 15th at 2 o'clock, where we'll be addressing proactive emergency communications, being ahead of the game. And also we open up membership for ZeroNow. If you go to zeronow.org, you'll see in the upper right hand corner, it says join now. You can take a look at the different levels and be a part of this community if you're focused on proactive campus and school safety and willing to work together to collaborate to find new solutions to drive ideas, innovation, and investment in campus and school safety. Then this is the place to be. We'll continue this conversation. Thank you again, everybody. We'll see you next month. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Thanks,
Take
Ara.
care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.